today's lecture is one of the most important stories in all of Western civilization. It's one of the most important stories in all of human existence because it is the story of the first century BC, the first century from 100 BC down to 0, the first century BC. It is the story of that century. And that century is the critical 100 years in the history of Rome, the most important century in the 1,000-year story of Rome. Now, why is that century so important? Because it is in that century, it is in that 100 years, from 100 BC to 1 or 0, 0, that the Roman Republic is lost. The Roman Republic that was 400 years old by 100 is lost. That is, it disappears. It changes into something that is no longer the Republic. Now, with 2,000 years of study of Rome later in history up to the present time, people in all later centuries turned to this story, this 100 years, to try to understand what happened to Rome. People knew that Rome was one of the greatest civilizations ever created, one of the greatest states, one of the greatest empires, one of the most complex, one of the richest, and therefore people wanted to know what went wrong, what happened. And therefore they looked back at all the centuries of the Roman story, from say 500 AD to 500 BC, and they asked, where in that 1,000-year story did the great state of Rome go off the tracks, go wrong? And they came back again and again to this 100 years. This century has been understood to be a critical one by all of the Americans, all the American founders, all the later American presidents who read Roman history, Abraham Lincoln, for example, and all the French revolutionaries, Rousseau, Montesquieu, all of the great French philosophers of the 18th century. They studied this century too, for the same question, what happened? The French were building their own French Republic in the 1790s, and they too were studying Roman history. Now, when they turned to the first century BC, they could see immediately that there were two preeminent figures in the story to tell us what had happened. Two people, above all the others. We're going to see lots of them tonight, but there were two. The first was Julius Caesar. Everybody knew in Rome in the year 50 BC that it was Caesar, and 49 and 40. Everybody knew then that it was all about Caesar. What was going to happen? What was he going to do? So that was one. And everybody understands the first century BC is the great age of Julius Caesar. Born in the year 100, died in the year 44. So those years are the critical years in terms of Julius Caesar. Now, one other person is part of the story too. He is not as powerful politically, but he is as powerful in the terms of public perception, opinion, moral authority, political tradition, and finally, in the last 3 months of his life, political heroism. I would say the last 3 years of this man's life is the greatest example of pure, undiluted, altruistic political heroism without equal. And his name? Cicero. Cicero. He is an exact contemporary of Caesar. They know each other all through their lives. They see each other right before Caesar dies. And then when Caesar is gone in 44 BC, Cicero is there, left standing as the last most admired member of that generation. So, those are our two heroes tonight. Those are our two figures of the story tonight. In their story together, in their shared story of the first century, we see the whole unfolding of the Roman Republic and its denouement. We'll use a little French word to mean the ending of it. For our interest here tonight, we're looking at the forum, And this will be our last picture too. So in a sense, this is the scene of the evolution of the political state, the Roman political state. Let's just remember what we talked about before. Why Rome? Why is it where it is? Why is it a success? Number one, a unique location on the river. So we've already mentioned that. Unique location that linked it to the Greeks. So all of the Eastern culture that was more advanced than the Roman is accessible in Italy. Parts of Italy are Greek. A unique location that linked them to the Etruscans, just north of Rome, and a unique location that linked them to the Carthaginians. We also talked about what Rome did. With this extraordinary achievement that is certainly proceeding between 500 BC and 100 BC, we now come to the crisis of the first century. What exactly was it? Where did it come from? What was wrong? What was going wrong in 130, 120, and 110 BC so that people who were born around 100, and tonight we're going to meet a whole generation, they're all born around 100. This is definitely the generation that is going to make the decisions and transform Rome into some different thing. This generation and this moment, 100 BC, what was it all about? What was the crisis? What was happening? What was going to happen between 120 BC, 110, 100, and 90? Number one, if we look back at the previous 200 years, something quite extraordinary had been going on. The Roman state had been successful without any precedent. There was simply nothing in the annals of history, not China, not India, not Egypt, in which a state had such unbroken success in expanding its civilization step by step by step by step, and then expanding it with an army which was invincible. And then building an administrative structure in the wake of the army, which itself was invincible. So in that long march, 500 BC, 400, 300, and 200, in that long march, this state had been building a larger and larger and larger state in the Mediterranean. And as it did so, it won battles against its enemies, including the Carthaginians. So that's Hannibal at about 200 BC. It won victories over its enemies. And when these victories took place, inevitably, and this was what all civilizations did, it won all the territory. So overnight, in a huge triumph against the Carthaginians, all of a sudden, the Roman state extended into Spain. All of a sudden, all of Spain fell into the hands of the Romans as they pushed back the Carthaginians. And so overnight, just in weeks, the entire Iberian Peninsula went from being shared among Greeks, Carthaginians, and some little bit of the East in the Roman hands, to this great big huge piece of real estate fell into Roman hands. Now, think about that. Think about what's implied in that. A huge amount of territory suddenly is handed over to a very small number of men who represent the Roman state. The first one that is most important is the general who's on the scene, whoever it is. And in the case of Spain, later, it will be two men, Pompey and Caesar. Both those generals will be in Spain and will extend the Roman control of Spain and will have a great deal to say about what's going to happen to it. So therefore, both in the time of the triumph over the Carthaginians and then later from 200 down to 100, in that evolution of the confrontation between Carthage and Rome, all of a sudden, overnight, Rome controlled millions of people and thousands and thousands and thousands of square acres. Now, what happened to all those people and what happened to all that territory? Well, it fell into Roman hands. In terms of the people, often at the end of a huge battle, like the battle over the capital of Carthage in close to 200 BC, thousands and thousands and thousands of Carthaginians went from being the citizens of a very prosperous and rich state to slaves. overnight they went from being free citizens to prisoners. And when a general conquered a whole city or a region or a province and suddenly had 20, 30, 40,000 or 100,000 people rounded up with a small army to hold on to them, these people then were turned into slaves. And then you had to decide what to do with all these slaves. And of course, you could put them on boats, you could send them back to your capital, or you could sell them to slave dealers, international slave dealers, and that's often what happened. So overnight, a huge city, a huge state would go from being free and independent to conquered by the conquering general. And in that moment of conquest, the overall economy of the Mediterranean suddenly acquired 50,000 slaves, 60,000, 70,000, 80,000. Now, what happened to all these slaves? Well, they were often shipped to slave auctions. And slave auctions took place all over the Mediterranean, but on the island of Delos in Greece was one of the biggest. And we have records from this slave market. Many of these records are, on stone, and so they're preserved. And so we have records from the slave market of Delos, D-E-L-O-S, and those records show that on one day, in about 60 or 70 BC, 10,000 slaves were auctioned off in one day. Now do the math, figure out that slave market maybe is running 300 days a year, and how many slaves do you have? Well, I can't do the math. It's a lot. And that's one slave market. So, in the extension of Rome, in the continuing conquests of neighboring territories, often provoked by neighbors against Rome. So this wasn't all unprovoked aggression, not at all. In many cases, they're reacting. In the case of Carthage, the Carthaginians sent their army to Rome itself before finally Rome was able to push them back. And finally, in the last step, they themselves went back to the capital, Carthage, and conquered them. So, in this working out of the dynamics of a very successful state, the Mediterranean economy, the political and the economic neighborhood of the whole of the Mediterranean, was acquiring massive amounts of new territory changing hands and stateless peoples being thrown into slavery. Now, both of those things was going to have a huge impact on Rome and the Roman state, because the Roman state had started as a city, as a little city government of a few thousand people who then were tens of thousands and then were hundreds of thousands, and now controlled the whole peninsula and soon would control the entire Mediterranean. So in the growth from 500 BC down to 1 in those 500 years, the growth of Rome was going to throw into the middle of the Roman constitution problems no one had ever thought of.